So we'll jump right in because we've got lots to chat about this evening and a really, really excellent panel that I'm so excited for. So thank you so much to everybody for joining this evening. My name is Chloe. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm one of this year's co-chairs with Women's March Ottawa. First and foremost, we want to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. Women's March Ottawa acknowledges that we organize, work, and live on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. While we know that land acknowledgements are growing more common, we wanted to use this as an intentional and thoughtful way to position ourselves and to provide meaningful and thankful acknowledgement to the Indigenous communities whose land we occupy. As we organize around feminist issues, we recognize the importance of ensuring that this work is both anti-racist and decolonial in nature. We recognize the ways in which our presence on this land upholds colonialism and reproduces dispossession and violence for Indigenous peoples. For those of us who are settlers, we commit to working and learning more about how we can prioritize the rights of Indigenous peoples and encourage participants to consider this both during and after this session. First, a little bit about Women's March Ottawa before we officially start today's session. Formed in 2017, Women's March Ottawa is an Ottawa-based, entirely volunteer-run group committed to challenging all forms of systemic discrimination, bias, and oppression. We believe unwaveringly in building an inclusive feminist movement that centers Indigenous, Black, racialized, disabled, low-income, young, old, newcomer, refugee, and 2S LGBTQ+ women and gender-diverse people. Traditionally, our program has consisted of a yearly march for gender equity and justice, but this year, both in hopes of expanding our reach and our work, as well as obviously due to COVID-19, we have pivoted to a full week of free online programming designed to bring feminists together to discuss a range of timely and important topics and issues. If you're not already, we encourage you to check out and register for the other events going on this week, as well as follow us on social media at Ottawa March across all platforms. We're also incredibly grateful for any financial donations to help support this week of programming, as well as future events. And to that end, we're grateful to the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions, Rogers, Councillor Teresa Kavanagh, and our generous individual donors for supporting this week of events. I'll pop some information about registering for other events this week, our social media, and how to donate to support WMO in the chat now, or in the chat in a second. So for today's session in particular, we're here to continue our week of programming with a discussion on trans-inclusive feminism. We're joined today by 4 incredible panelists, as well as an incredible guest moderator who will answer a number of questions and share their knowledge and experience with us over the next hour or so. If we have time at the end, we'll open up space for Q&A, though we have learned that these can go a little bit tight. So if you have questions, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on Zoom. And if we have time at the end, we'll try to get to them. And for those who wish to use it, closed captioning is enabled for this call, and you can enable or disable it at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we welcome folks to add comments or thoughts using the chat feature on Zoom throughout the panel. At the same time, we are implementing a strict policy to ensure this space is safe and respectful. So please know that any comments or behavior that is hateful or disrespectful will result in you being immediately removed from the webinar. Now, with those logistic pieces out of the way, to officially kick off the session, I would like to introduce our incredible moderator and speakers. So moderating this evening's session is Debbie Osu-Acha. Debbie is a Black feminist with over 8 years of local and international advocacy experience in a variety of roles ranging from programming and counseling to policy analysis and project management. She is the new executive director at the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, or CCGSD. She has had the pleasure of bridging her passion for social justice with international development at Oxfam Canada and volunteering with feminist organizations like the Ottawa Dyke March, Harmony House Women's Shelter, and Planned Parenthood Ottawa. When Debbie isn't yelling into a megaphone at protests or organizing events, she's probably on a field somewhere playing rugby or baking a cake. Our first panelist is Jade Byard-Peak, a young trans African Nova Scotian and ONU curator, educator, and community advocate originally from Halifax, Nova Scotia. She is currently working as the Director of Advocacy and Community Care at Kindspace. Since studying her BA in art history at NSCAD University, Jade's work has spanned developing a standard with the Canadian Standard Association for the Psychological Health and Safety for Post-Secondary Students, to leading and co-authoring a 64-page toolkit for combating anti-Black racism for student unions during her tenure as Deputy Chairperson for the Canadian Federation of Students. Jade strives to create a gentle but rigorous point of entry to anti-oppression, intersectional research, and paths to solutions through workshops, seminars, hubs, and curatorial endeavors. Next, we've got Lyra Evans, who uses she, her pronouns, an environmental chemist at the University of Ottawa, a longtime community activist for the LGBTQ and homeless communities, and the first, and regrettably still only, trans school board trustee in Canada. A longtime believer in socialist values, she stood for the NDP in the 2018 provincial election as the first trans candidate for a political party in Ontario, and supports the local Ottawa Street Medics in their efforts to provide necessities to homeless communities and logistical support to progressive protests around the city. Formerly a volunteer for Planned Parenthood Ottawa and a youth coordinator at the Youth Services Bureau, she got her start in intersectional feminism and environmental advocacy as a homeless teenager on the streets and shelters of Ottawa. We're also joined by Faye Johnstone, whose pronouns are she, they, a principal consultant with Wisdom to Action and an advocate, writer, and educator on mental health, combating gender-based violence, and promoting 2S LGBTQ+ inclusion. She has led projects locally and nationally focused on strengthening mental health services with a specific focus on facilitating meaningful youth and community engagement within mental health services and the mental health sector more broadly. Faye currently serves on the board of directors for Kindspace and is a member of the Ontario Youth Suicide Prevention Leadership Committee. Previously, Faye served on the board of directors for the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity and LGBT Youthline, as well as the Strategic Advisory Council of the Ontario Centre of Excellence for Child and Youth Mental Health. You can follow Faye on Twitter at Faye Johnstone. Finally, we have Yasmin Prasad, who is the Trans Program Coordinator for the Trans People of Color Project at the 519. She is also the Research Coordinator for the Trans Women HIV Research Initiative at Women's College Hospital. She has worked over the past 15 years with trans intersectional communities and service providers to create, reduce, and allow access for trans folks to social services access across the province. With those incredible and illustrious introductions out of the way, I'm going to hand it over to Debbie to start us off with today's discussion. So over to you, Debbie.
Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you for all joining us today for what I'm really looking forward to. It's what I think is going to be a very exciting conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into the first question. And this one is for all of our panelists today. So whomever would like to speak first, feel free to jump right in. You know, we wanted to start off today with vocabulary and key concepts, recognizing that for some folks watching, some of the topics we're discussing today might actually be entirely new for them. So to start off the conversation, let's define both trans exclusionary radical feminism, as well as trans inclusion or liberation. Who would like to go first? Okay, I see you.
I was gonna unmute and I was gonna just like wait and see, but I've also been like thinking about TERFs a lot lately for a bunch of reasons, so I'm always happy to speak to you. So maybe I'll tackle the like exclusionary side of this whole thing and then pass the inclusionary to somebody else. So like TERFs, or trans exclusionary radical feminism, is a like offshoot of mainstream feminism, or of like feminism itself, that very much emphasizes this idea that our oppression, or like the oppression of women, is inherently inextricably and fundamentally tied to biological sex. It's this idea that everything in this world is grounded in this pure fact that women are the most oppressed people, and woman is only people who have certain kinds of bodies, and anyone outside of that is privileged in relationship to it and is not to be reflected within our feminist movement. So like trans exclusion radical feminism more broadly is very much this ideology that says that trans women in particular, and all trans and gender diverse folks, aren't the people that we say we are not welcome or don't have a right to women's spaces. And even more than that, the idea that our identities and our bodies are a tool of patriarchy and capitalism and oppression itself, that is being used to infiltrate women's spaces, which is a whole lot of really icky and insidious messaging that is blatantly false and should never ever be trusted, but nonetheless is persistent and difficult to tackle because it's connected to ideas that many, folks in our communities do actually hold. And so the like TERFs are almost like a radical extreme expression of, a lot of, experiences or beliefs or identities within a very transphobic society. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Faye. Did anyone want to talk about it from the perspective of trans inclusion or liberation? Yasmin.
So I think when we start the conversation about trans inclusion and liberation, often for me, I often think of the historical context of feminism and who've been included, whose voices have not been included, and where are we going. So when we say trans inclusion, actually, who are we really talking about? Who are these trans people that we say need to be included? Is it based on certain things? Is it based on certain privilege? Is it based on certain past abilities? Is it, based on where you are, your social location? Is it where you work? All these different pieces, because many of the folks that I work with who are trans women of color, trans inclusion and trans feminism to them is something very, very different. And what that piece of inclusion means to different folks is what we start, and we need to have those voices and to hear those, especially when we start talking about folks who are refugees or sex workers or all these multiple intersecting, identities. These are what, to me, inclusion starts to build on. It starts again to talk about, like, from the grassroots level, spiraling up, going across, and really dismantling a lot of the stuff, again, like what Faye, has mentioned in the radical sense of feminism. So that's my take on the inclusion piece.
Absolutely. Definitely rooted in, like, what I think is a true radical sense of feminism. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you both. Lyra, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I tend to think about inclusion not only as bringing people to the table, but amplifying the voices of the people you have now added to the table. Because just simply inviting trans women to a feminist organization and then doing what you were intending to do anyways doesn't actually amplify their voices or amplify the concerns or help the trans community in any meaningful way. You have to not only invite them to the table, you have to then listen to the needs of the community and do what they say. And so I think that's an important distinction that prevents tokenization of trans identities. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, so I'll bite my tongue.
Thank you. And just wanted to see if anyone else wanted to add to that. I know that there was a lot of really awesome responses there.
Yeah, I'll just hijack on that. But I think another way of looking at inclusion, and specifically if we look at history, we look at the way in which women, cis women primarily, throughout the the 60s and 70s and primarily the 80s, were included in the workforce. But the gender gap, the institutions in which women were working for, were not built for women or with women in mind, or their bodies, or their identities, or thoughts, or feelings, or agency. And so when we look at trans inclusion, specifically in the 21st century, as there is a solid attempt by, as Faye describes as mainstream feminism, which we can argue, is it third or fourth, but has specifically looked at introducing, and allowing trans exclusion to happen. And specifically, for it to be really inclusionary, are you giving someone a seat at the table? Or are you helping them build, or are you building a new table with them? And so the results are going to look very different depending on how you go about it.
That's beautiful. I love that analogy on not necessarily just inviting people to the table, but building a table with them, which also includes, fundamentally changing the way our institutions work. I think it's beautiful. Yasmin, I know you unmuted. I wanted to see if you had anything else to add before we move to the next question.
I just wanted to also say, when we start talking about trans inclusion, there are many cis women who are still not included in the feminist movement. So as much as, like, we surround ourselves by this topic and we have that great push to be part of the feminist movement, there are many women who are still left behind, cis women and of course trans women, but also to recognize that. And these are folks who have been knocking on doors for a long time and saying, hey, let me in, I'm here, see me, hear me, and they still have been excluded. So it opens up a broader question when we start talking about trans inclusion, yes, but also there's still folks who have been left behind, other, cis women or cis people who've been wanting to be part of the movement.
Absolutely. It's almost like it's a needed collective effort to kind of really shake up feminism as a whole to ensure that all people are included. I love that. So wanted to move on to the next question. And this one, I'm looking at both you, Jade and Yasmin. Both of you have done work specifically that addresses the overlap between race, gender, and other systems of oppression. And Yasmin, you were just touching on that. Jade, I know that you wrote an op-ed a few years ago for International Women's Day that closed with the following statement. I hope we will recognize that trans-exclusionary radical feminism works hand in hand with the patriarchy and can only be torn down by intersectional feminism. So for both of you, can you elaborate on that and share a little bit more about the relationship between trans inclusion and intersectionality as a framework?
Yeah, I'll start off by recognizing my ancestors, my aunts, you know, my mother, my grandmother. I also want to, who've been practicing intersectional feminism for a very long time, and especially now that it includes, you know, trans people like myself. You know, I'm very privileged to be in a situation in which, so I thank my family, and I also think I want to give a shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, who, at least in the academic sense, brought and created the term intersectional feminism. And I think when we use that word, we use it oftentimes to talk about all sorts of intersections. And I think that's really important. But at the time, it was supposed to be, you know, it was specifically focusing on, you know, Black women, specifically working class Black women, and looking at the, you know, the privileges and the power of looking in anywhere between race, class, and gender. And now intersectional feminism has been expanded and well understood to include women with disabilities, trans women, looking at different intersectional feminism, looking at intersectionality as a whole concept. And trans radical, you know, TERFs, I'm going to just say conveniently for me, you know, there is a lot of weaponization of trauma. And TERFs and trans exclusionary radical feminists work to, you know, to manipulate people online. So a way that I will describe it is that this ideology is an offshoot from second wave feminism from the 60s and 70s. But not everyone who operates within this type of feminism is necessarily from that, especially since the 2000s and the media, social media evolution. We've seen these groups in the way in which, you know, trans radical, you know, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, their only mission is to target, dox, and harass trans women. And this comes from a form of feminism that is anti-man. So it is not necessarily about the equity of women, and that's not the focus of that feminism. The focus of that feminism is focused towards the perpetrators of violence. And so often what is used is that, you know, trans women are denied their humanity, trans women are denied their whole existence, and so are other trans people, to fit an image that is being spread by trans exclusional radical feminists. And oftentimes this is consisted of anti-choice types of feminists, folks that are more conservative minded in terms of feminism, and specifically believe, as Faye mentioned earlier, that trans women are sort of danger or a Trojan horse to violence. And I think that this, you know, that weaponization of trauma is something that not only makes it as sticky, but also makes it really hard for trans women. And there is a constant denial, I think, of science, of understand, you know, not only the scientific developments in the last 40 years of not only understanding trans people, but also, you know, it creates a harder situation, you know, for trans women like myself. And, you know, I'm in a situation where I move through the world in a very feminine way. You know, I identify with all sort of gender markers that the Western world prescribes of what women should act or be like, because that works for me. But not all women, and not all, especially, you know, cis or trans women, operate that way or have, you know, there's various different types of gender expression. So even for those who are, you know, giving in or feel accepted by presenting the way that they do, they still are not allowed to use certain washrooms. And so you see, you know, are not allowed in certain spaces. So you see what is gender segregation. And why that is rooted in the patriarchy is because even if you look at you know, we look at racism in Canada, that's a whole other story, and let's talk about it some other time. But even if you look at the ways in which this land was viewed, you know, the Western world, when it was colonized, was viewed as feminine, ready to be conquered, ready to be taken over. So even from the beginning of colonization, there has been an aspect of mounting and controlling and coercing. And even when, you know, in Canada after 1833, when Black folks were given rights, it was only Black men, you know, during the time of Sir John A. Macdonald and Confederation, Black men in Nova Scotia had the right to vote if they owned land. So once again, when you have sort of class, when you have, and, you know, and specifically gender. And then of course, you know, finally at a certain point where Black men get to vote. And we see over a course of period of time how Black women are left behind when women, you know, get the right to vote. And then you see, you know, ways in which laws are written. So even then there's a hierarchy. And trans-exclusional radical feminists believe in that hierarchy. But they also believe, again, that while many genders may have different types of birthing bodies, is that, for example, my mom would no longer be considered a woman under that rhetoric because she's had her uterus removed. And so there is an idea, again, around biological sex and sexual functions that describe gender there, and so you'll see the same sort of rhetoric used, and you'll see the same sort of, messaging, but there is no movement from that messaging. There's no intersectionality, there's no analysis. Basically it is an echo chamber that exists on Facebook and other spaces where the sort of, a TERF is going to write an article for another TERF, and sort of that information is cyclical. And I think I'll add one more thing to that, not only about how it relates to patriarchy, but this is also a global movement, trans-exclusionary radical feminists. And it often operates, successfully in the global South. And and especially it happens here too, in a lot of violence, but every year when we are reading out names, we're reading out, Latinx folks and women of color across the globe who are in places where, we might have now just recently in Canada protections, but places where protections don't exist. And oftentimes the people perpetuating this are also white women from the West perpetuating sort of this, this sort of colonization. And this is the same sort of colonization that was used to colonize through, I'm a Christian woman, but Christianity was used in order to colonize and to erase 2S LGBT people from identities. And so oftentimes I have to argue about my two-spirit identity with TERFs who are just like, actually, I'm married to an Indigenous woman and you don't exist, And so there is sort of this this type of rhetoric that exists. And that's a lot of what it is. It's just unfortunate that sometimes that leads to policy. And so I think that, again, TERF's ideology can only exist within a patriarchy. And once you recognize intersectional feminism and you're tearing down sort of the systems that have been built by men, is that you're recognizing that you are building systems that have not only trans women and women and gender diverse people in mind, but you're actually building that from the ground up. And so I think that, like, when referring to that and referring to intersectionality, that can only occur when you're able to address the fact that colonization and any upholding of that is part of patriarchy and toxic masculinity, and you just can't separate it.
So that was a beautiful answer. I love that. Thank you, Jade. Yasmin, I wanted to know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, and thanks, Jade, for bringing up all those points. But again, I think when we use the word intersectionality is a loaded word. And for many folks who start to add intersectionality to the word feminism, sometimes feel like, okay, we've kind of done it, and we've added the word, and we're going to include everybody. But I also want to talk to and address around the stigmatization that trans women face because of race, because of, and when that stigmatization and that marginalization is so much put on trans women, especially of color or of different experiences, sometimes it's often the notion that we need to get this particular type of people into feminism. When for many of these folks, they're not going in that direction, but we make that assumption. They're going in the direction of they need survival skills, they need housing, they need food to deal with food insecurity, they need to deal with the police, they need access to care. So yes, feminism is a lot of the direction we want to go, but we always have to think about when we going in that direction and when we fighting for this rights, yes, to be included in the feminist movement, there's so many other pieces around social determinant of health that we need to look at that folks need now. So it's a great journey, and it's a lot of good energy put into it. But I often have to hold back myself sometimes and think about if I'm fighting to be in this movement, what am I really fighting for? Who am I fighting? Am I fighting to save my mental health, stability, and to support the folks around me and deal with all these, multiple levels of oppression that, for many folks, that I work with and I see on a day-to-day basis, that's what they really need. Yes, we may call it feminism for them, or they may call it feminism, but what they're really talking about is inclusion and really reducing barriers to access services. Now, when we start to think about racism, we need to also recognize intergenerational racism and trauma, and how this plays out in terms of of again, inclusion and feminism, how that trauma has been, passed on from generation to generation to generation, and how we're dealing with that trauma. So when we are too included in these spaces, sometimes parts of those trauma comes up. And how do we deal with that? So, like the typical, probably white woman who haven't had the experience of immigration and going through a refugee process will totally be, feel quite comfortable in that space. And for a trans woman who has experienced all these different forms of oppression, when she get there and fighting for this, sometimes have to relive all this trauma. So we also need to recognize that too.
Thank you both for answering that question so beautifully. Really appreciate it. Now, the next question, it is open to everyone to answer, but it's very Ottawa specific. So I feel like I'm going to throw that question to both Lyra and Faye, just to kind of touch on some of the work that both of you folks have been doing here in the city. And while we know this isn't new, especially in this town, for the past few years, we've been seeing a rise of transphobia in Ottawa and elsewhere, of course. What is or should be the role of feminist movements in helping combat this? And what can both feminist individuals and organizations do to make their advocacy more inclusive? So I'd love to hear from both, from everyone, but in particular, Faye and Lyra, I would love to know what your thoughts are on this question.
Yeah, so I think I have a couple of causes for the rise in transphobia in Ottawa, and I'm going to start there. So I don't know how many people follow American politics, but I do so not out of a love of American politics, but because it inundates everything I have on social media and through our news. And so some of you might have heard that Caitlyn Jenner is running for the Republican Party to be the governor of California and has been spouting anti-trans rhetoric as a trans individual, talking about how we can't have trans people in women's sports, talking about how we can't have same-sex marriage. And I think that is a symptom of a larger societal pushback against trans individuals from social groups that don't like change because they are currently at the top of the societal power peak. If you were to draw a structure of society, these people who are pushing back against allowing trans individuals to flourish would be people who have systemic power in society. And they have used their existing systemic power to push this narrative that nothing can change, and are using trans issues as a wedge to drive fights between members of the lower class. If they point to working class folks and say, the reason you're poorer than you were 10 years ago or than your parents were is because trans individuals are getting resources for mental health, or trans individuals are getting rights and therefore they're getting special privileges. They're using trans individuals to drive a wedge between members of the existing working class. And then the second thing that I wanted to touch on was the complacency of allyship. So in Canada, we tend to do a lot of patting ourselves on the back. We say, well, we've passed a gay marriage bill in 2005, we passed a trans rights bill, and therefore we've solved all of our problems. LGBTQ people are great, and we have nothing else to worry about. And that, I think, runs into problems because it stops the average person from looking critically at the needs of the LGBTQ population. So when the average person says, well, we've done all these major things, why should we still be talking about this? They become less willing to say, maybe we need to look at mental health resources for trans individuals. Maybe we need to look at more programs for LGBTQ individuals who are street involved. There's a depressing statistic that is now a number of years old, but it was 40% of homeless teenagers in Ottawa were LGBTQ. And that is, I'm going to say, way above the average across the general population. And so what is it about being LGBTQ that is causing these people to end up homeless? Is it mental health problems that are causing family problems? Is it cultural pushback from family? There are a number of things that it could be, but we haven't committed the resources to finding out, and we haven't committed the resources to helping these people who are now street-involved teenagers, and who, if they don't get the support as teenagers, will end up becoming street-involved adults, will end up picking up trauma, will end up picking up addictions issues. And I think the last thing that I sort of wanted to point to and focus on is the allyship that a lot of people exhibit only exists when there are trans people in the room. A lot of people that I am peripherally aware of will use the correct pronouns when I'm nearby, or will think about LGBTQ issues when I'm standing nearby or when I'm in the same conversations as them. But as soon as there isn't an active monitor looking at people, that's when trans individuals get misgendered. That's when trans individuals are left out of the conversation. That is when trans individuals are no longer being thought about. And there aren't enough of us to be active monitors in every conversation. And it requires good allyship to come out and say, we know that these people, we know that trans individuals have these issues, and you can't misgender them just because they're not here. We need to talk about trans mental health even if they're not present, because otherwise it puts a lot of burden on the trans individuals who are engaged to constantly be making sure that everyone else holding everybody else to account. And that was very long-winded, and I apologize.
I might just like build off of that because I have very many thoughts. Just so I want to maybe start with some context for folks like around this question. So, you know, anti-trans TERF organizing is like not new in any community, like it's alive and well everywhere. But over the past, I would say like couple months in particular in Ottawa, we've seen like TERFs posturing downtown, posturing up anti-trans posters, tons of anti-trans rhetoric, like lots of icky stuff. And so I think that's a bit of the context for this question. And also more broadly, we're seeing, you know, during the trans rights bill federally in 2017, we saw a lot of anti-trans and TERF organizations mobilizing in that context. And then we've actually seen it to a degree that is surprising me even more so in the federal fight to ban conversion therapy. So we're seeing dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations parroting the same, like, you're threatening women's rights rhetoric that has been like time and again disproven, including by like the Canadian Bar Association, which I do think is important to cite because like they are the legal authorities on like a lot of things. And if they say that something isn't actually a thing, I do tend to trust them more than I trust some like random anti-trans Twitter persona. But just to put that in context on one end, I also want to give the context that for folks who aren't paying attention or might not know this, over the past year or two, we've seen massive organizing in the UK and the US that is specifically connected to anti-trans advocacy, that is specifically inundating and pushing this very trans exclusionary radical feminist agenda. At the moment, there are dozens of bills making their way through courthouses in the United States of America. There are many, many global connections happening here where we're seeing anti-trans groups on the international stage actually working in the UN and other international spaces to attack trans rights. Like that is the broader context of what's happening in Ottawa. And that actually is part of why I think it's getting worse in Ottawa, because these folks don't just like sit in their basements. These folks talk to each other and they see what's going on in the UK and they see what's going on in the US, and they look at those groups, those like anti-gay, anti-trans groups that are social conservative, and they look at people like Jordan Peterson, who's had a lot of success lately, and they say, I wonder if we could learn something from this. And so they employ similar tactics. They use coded messaging that is going to relate to your average, like to a norm, to a middle-class white guy in the suburb, or to a middle-class white mom, or a woman who thinks that, you know, these trans people are coming after her rights and doesn't process it beyond that, or whose relationship to feminism, justifiably in many ways, is associated with liberating her body from the patriarchy and the oppression of patriarchy. But TERFs stint that or twist that frame and use it to create this ridiculous notion that trans people are threatening women's rights, which is again disproven. But so just to put that into context, that I think is why we're seeing greater anti-trans organizing. And that is actually what scares me right now. I don't think that they're winning. I don't think that they're going to stop a federal conversion therapy ban. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think that public displays and advocacy and work like they're doing, targeting trans people, normalizes and almost encourages a lot of the everyday violence trans people face. And so I actually do want to draw the line between TERFs, who are thinking of this, like who have this idea that you need to be suspicious of everyone's gender because there might be a fake man in the space. And I want to connect that to the fact that I know most trans people that in my life are afraid to leave the house, especially trans women, especially trans feminine folks, especially if they don't pass as, if their gender expression is complicated. And that idea that our genders and our bodies are to be questioned, and that feminists and women should question the bodies of other people, is fundamentally inherently tied to anti-trans harassment in public. But I want to end just to bring it back to what Yasmin was saying earlier, because I don't do frontline work. I do like community level work. I do angry activisty work, and I do policy work. But the thing that I want feminist orgs to actually take away from this is not just, be nice to trans people, but think about food security, think about poverty. We have frontline 2SLGBTQ communities that are broke. We have organizations that are going above and beyond to serve communities that are massively struggling with shoestring budgets. And I know we're going to touch on the budget, and we have a question on the budget, but if we're actually talking about creating, intersectional feminism isn't just about having everybody at the table, it's about having concrete proposals to deliver on liberation. Delivering on liberation also means making sure that people have food, making sure that people have housing and shelter. And that is what's missing. That is what's missing. We need to make sure that we have the resources and leadership in place so that trans folks in all of their diversity, and all folks in all of their diversity, have access to housing. I think that's a pretty good pillar of trans inclusive feminism, is give people homes. And let's just start there.
Beautiful.
Absolutely.
I love
yes.
that.
Yeah, giving people the resources that they need, rather than being on this sort of far-fetched lens or spectrum of when communities and when folks are dying, literally, because they can't get enough of what they need. And this is how the movement should really, connect and remember, all of this came from grassroots organization and grassroots organizing. And we need to in a way come back to that and really support folks who need this stuff. Because when we look at it, just from the work that I do, 80% of the trans people that I encounter are experiencing all of these things. The other 20 is probably experiencing a little bit less or have a lot more, privilege in some places. But for the most part, what I see, and I've been doing this work for 20 years, is, the lack of to get this. I remember coming to Ottawa 15 years plus ago to train all the sexual health workers who work in ASOs and sexual health services. And if I tell you the resistance that I felt at that time, as a young trans woman of color, you and what they said to me in front of my face, and I can't believe 15 years later, Ottawa is still experiencing this huge amount of transphobia from what you folks are saying. So it almost sometimes feel like, we haven't pushed the clock in any direction. And that's 15 years ago when there was no, human rights code and all this stuff in place, no federal protection and all that. So this is actually quite surprising to me.
I think it's tricky, right? I think we live in a world where communities need, I don't actually know we need to talk theory, right? We need intersectional feminist movements, and we need to critique those movements to be better. And we also need those organizations representing those movements to be better. But we also need food, and how, and that's where I think that we are often stuck as a movement is how do you balance both of those things? Because Jade and you both do frontline crisis work around trans and LGBTQ communities. And then how do we channel that up the pipeline to actually get good pay and benefits and funding and resources, everything there.
Mm-hmm. And access to surgeries and all these other stuff that, But
give us all of the above, please.
Yeah,
Jade, I know you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I wanna loop in what everybody's saying, and I also want to loop back to Lyra's point, because I think she hit the nail on the head, and all of you have. And I think one of the biggest scary parts of specifically around you know, specifically around trans inclusion or intersectional feminism or anything around sort of the acceptance model of it, is that it's been literally the rhetoric around it has been very neoliberal. And one of the biggest issues with that is that trans feminism has become sort of, or trans inclusion has become sort of a stamp, you know, a cure-all. And so that is really true. But it also means that when you have rhetoric that is being spread and used to win elections, but no results. I mean, right now it's 3 months still that, you know, that gay men have to wait to donate blood. But guess what? Oh yeah, the liberals added trans women too. You know, we've seen, you know, an end to the blood ban, but we went from, you know, to 3 years to 1 year to now 3 months. And it's like, end the blood ban, do the testing, you know, why does this need to sort of continue on? And I think, you know, as somebody who has, you know, who especially was very active in Halifax, I'm active in Ottawa through activism, but I spent a lot of my time, you know, doing sex work, being street involved in Halifax, and specifically doing a lot of advocacy. And one of the, I think this is something beautiful to even see this conversation happening to with Women's March Ottawa, because I was very much of an antagonist to Women's March Halifax because of the way that they chose to tokenize, you know, and make it a performance of you know, of people, of women of color, of trans women. But I was being attacked by organizing Turks who were planning to harm, and I was trying to bring an attention to the way in which, you know, that specific march had been treating trans women, and looking at the attacks that had sort of taken place in the city and sort of the posters and things that were going on there. And they chose to, after getting over 10,000 comments of Turks fighting and sort of thinking, and I asked specifically not to delete the comment, because I was like, look at all these Turks. Look at all these Turks. I encourage them to come and write on this to see this is the problem that's in Halifax. And it did happen. And instead of messaging me, they completely deleted the post, and they reached out to everyone else who was involved, all the cis women, and decided not to even come and talk to me until they were able to get one of the BIPOC, or one of the women of color who were organizing, the one of two, to address me and say, oh, there's nothing wrong. We have Chinese women dancers and stuff, so it's all good. We're all great. And so, you know, when we create a spectacle of identities and say, you know, our intersectionality is actually just going to be a multicultural festival, that's not doing the work. That's just saying, look at us, we're great, we're all shiny and new, and using people as tokens. And this only enrages and frustrates social conservatives that are consistent. You know, Lara, you brought it up, Faye, specifically in the United States, in the UK, and even in Canada. Canada is always 10 years behind. You know, we are 10 years ahead and 10 years behind, both in terms of, you know, getting, you know, sorts of advocacy wins, but we're also 10 foot behind at seeing escalation in terms of extremism. And something that is very important to recognize is that many trans exclusional radical feminists are also very much engaged with white supremacist organizations and the far right in fascism. And so you will see often within the rise of fascism, in the consistent rise, especially as it rises in Canada, you will also see the same sort of voices also being trans exclusionary, also targeting trans women. And so I think that, you know, and not to be political, but, you know, being trans, being queer is being political, either you like it or not. But I think, you know, the fight of fascism is incredibly important, because that's where a lot of Turks get sort of their wind and support. And so I think that that's an important note that we don't often talk about. And I think the influence of the way in which working class people are pitted against each other, and the way in which, you know, everybody gets crumbs, but we're going to, you know, be very socially progressive and say the words, but not actually put our money where our mouth is. That only creates more division, creates more problems, and allows extremism to brew. And so it's very worrying. And I just wanted to synthesize that. So
maybe, Debbie, if I can just add one last thing.
Absolutely.
So I just lost my train of thought. So it was a really great thing. It was like really smart, I promise. But maybe Lyra can say the thing that I was thinking, and it's going to be equally brilliant.
So I want to mention to everybody in the audience that I frequently find I am misgendered more in progressive organizations that claim the mantle of intersectionality than I am in otherwise cis straight spaces, because as soon as there are some trans people in the room, everybody uses they for everybody. We cease to individualize pronouns and show respect to those who do not use they them pronouns. And whereas in spaces that are not intentionally trying to be actively progressive. They live in this sort of binary world where they're like, ah, yes, Lyra is the she her pronoun, so we'll just use she her for her. And it's sort of this thing that I find very weird, that as soon as there are one or two trans people, visibly trans people, because if there are stealth trans people, this doesn't happen. But as soon as there are visibly trans people in a space, everybody gets they them pronouns, and that is equally wrong for many trans people. Like, I don't use they them pronouns. When somebody says they or them and refers to me, that is equally wrong to using he him, and it hurts, and it shows that you're not trying to be trans inclusive correctly. You recognize that pronouns are important, so you're willing to change some of them, but you're not willing to do the active engagement and talk to people about their pronouns and then get them right. So I just wanted to.
Okay, and I remembered my thing. And I'll be brief, I promise. My only thing, like, I think coming back to the concrete ask of this question is, like, what can feminist orgs do? What feminist orgs can do is they can change how they talk about themselves and make it more inclusive of gender diversity, et cetera. And that is one thing. For frontline providing organizations, which is a big chunk of feminist orgs, talk to trans people. Like, literally, like, you actually do have to go through a process of reviewing your policies and procedures, your staff training, how you allocate resources, what bathrooms you have, what your policy is. So, for example, what happens if a cis woman is roomed with a trans woman and they don't get along? Like, actually, like, how do you actually manage that scenario? Are you ready to manage that scenario? You can manage that scenario in a way that is fine and dandy. It is not actually hard to manage. You give folks rooms with folks that they feel cozy with. Perfect. We solved an issue. But what happens is that orgs don't think that far, and then every moment turns into a crisis, and that crisis inevitably ends up with trans folks and trans women particularly being blamed. And so, and then nationally, when we're talking advocacy orgs, engage trans communities. Like, literally, I want to see a process, and I want to see a publicized process of how you are, while acknowledging your commitment to trans inclusion, how you are bringing trans issues and trans advocacy needs into your feminist agenda. We had a phenomenal, massive amount of funding committed in the last budget to fighting gender-based violence. That is incredible, huge. We got a paltry, slap in the face amount of funds for LGBTQ community organizations. We need both. We actually very much need both. We need both because our communities are connected, and we need feminist orgs, by and large, to acknowledge that. And that's my thought.
No, I love that, and I feel like this conversation is going to a beautiful point, but I'm looking at the clock and I know our time is running. So I want to probably leave the remainder of the conversation on this last question, and feel free to touch on the things that matter the most to you. I know we want, like, the federal budget came up for me, love it, as someone who really is trying to, like, ring the alarm when it comes to policy analysts on fundamentally changing the way policy informs the experiences of all LGBTQ people, but particularly trans women that are absent in GBV spaces. I want to hear about this perspective when it comes to, like, even racialized politics and the politics of, like, Black liberation, and how integral it's needed to see trans people and trans experiences within our communities as Black people centered. But that's a lot of what I want to see, but I want to hear from you folks. And so I do have one last question for us to sit on, and it's the following. In your opinion, what really is the potential for feminism in helping facilitate trans liberation? And what are the limitations to thinking about it through a feminist lens? And when might we need to look somewhere else to advance trans rights and justice?
So I can start and other people can build on it. And I'm going to start by saying I'm a chemist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a social worker. My academic background is not in queer theory. And so I don't come at trans liberation from a place of theory or from a place of, frankly, being well read on some of these issues. I come at it from a place of what are the needs of the community that I have experienced firsthand, that I have witnessed firsthand, and from the people that I have talked to. And so when I hear the question, what can feminism do to advance trans liberation? The question for me is, how do we make organizations that are trying to provide necessities for people provide the necessities that people need? So how do we make it so that the organizations that are trying to provide the necessities for people are the are inclusive are not doing more harm than good. That we're not traumatizing trans individuals by, like Faye was talking about, if you have a trans person and a cis person who are roomed together and then something happens and they don't get along and your instinct is to remove the trans person and isolate them, that is an inherently harmful act, and you can't do that. I couldn't tell you who wrote "that's a bad idea." I couldn't tell you which theory says that's a bad idea. I can just tell you that's a bad idea. So what I'd like to see out of feminist organizations is a shift towards end goals. What are we trying to accomplish? And recognize that organizations will make mistakes, individuals will make mistakes, and something I have found in my experience, particularly in online communities, is that we are very unforgiving of people who do not know everything that we already know. As somebody who didn't go to university to study queer theory and who didn't come at this from an academic background, we are very unkind as a community, as an internet community, or as activists to people who are still learning. And we need to be able to break things down into non-academic language. I heard the words neoliberal. I heard the words, there was another example that I did not write down, that were thrown out into the middle of this conversation that a lot of people, if we were to talk about this with them, they wouldn't understand what that means. And I think being able to reduce our message to something that everybody can understand and get behind. Everybody deserves housing. Everybody deserves healthcare. Everybody deserves food. These are essential human rights, and you cannot traumatize people who are getting access to these things. I think that is the direction that feminist organizations need to move. I don't know whether that's a limitation or a goal or a direction. It's just a stream of consciousness. So you can build off of that where you were, or you can disagree with me.
I think what they really need to do, from my experiences over all these years, is to let go. They need to let go because they holding on so strong to such a sort of outdated and sexist notion of what feminism means to them that they just can't, for some reason, let it go and hand it over to Jade and say, here's the torch, take it and run with it, hand it over to other folks who are doing the work, to Faye and everybody else, and say, here's it. And I find that holding on to that sense of power or whatever it is that they have, that's just the I don't know if it's a generational thing or if it's a power and privilege thing. I think it's a bit of everything, but they really need to just let go and say, we're not in 19 whatever anymore. We're in 2021, and this is what it is, and we need to understand it and move with it and hand the power over to the folks that who are ready to do the work, pick up the work, and create trans liberation, trans feminism, whatever you want to call it, the umbrella of feminism. But that's what I see. I see in a lot of organizations, especially some, grassroots organization where there's these strong feminists, cis, just holding on to the power till the end of, I don't know what it is. And sometimes just like, you just need to let go. When I deliver trainings to these organizations, I say, if you let go, it's going to be okay. The organization is not going to fall apart. It's not going to go to the ground. You can let go. And I think when they hear that, then they're like, okay. I said, there are folks who are ready to, we'll pick up the work and we'll still remain grounded in the work that you've done and what you're doing. But we will run with it. And we'll run with it in a good way. So.
Oh, I love that. I love the like, yeah. So I'm just processing that. So thank you. I think, if I were to end on a thought, it would be actually like, let's get back to some basics. Let's get people housed. Like I spend a lot of my time doing like very like fairly abstract trans policy stuff. So which is also like concretely connected to like changed lives and experiences, etc. But that's actually like we could come back to, and we actually should come back to, let's just get people housed, and let's make sure the people who are housing them aren't shit. Like as easy as that. If we can get that done, that will be a big step forward. But I also I'm excited for where trans communities are going to take this. Like I think I see I think we've had like issues as communities. We are hugely disconnected. We come from different walks of life in a billion different ways. But I also see like intergenerational relationships happening in a bigger way than I think they could have 5 years ago. I think even now though, like, and I am a 25-year-old trans woman in Ottawa, it's hard to name multiple trans folks, especially trans women. And if they are there, they are white folks. And it's like those folks are not with us in many cases. But I think, you know, we are building, and I'm excited to see what happens when, like, I'm old and I get to be the one who's like, these young folks are doing weird things. Like, I actually want, like, I am so excited at the idea of a trans kid who can grow up in a world where they're not afraid or worried that in any way their transness will change their, like, how they are treated. That is a really nice end goal that we can actually build more of our feminism around and towards.
Yeah, if I'm going to leave on a note, I think since folks have been talking more generally and expansive too, I think I'm going to focus more in on an internal thing and the way in which we move and process and hold each other accountable. And I think, you know, something was brought up specifically around, you know, me even using the term neoliberal. And I think that, you know, there is a lot of language that is trapped within academia that is inaccessible, doesn't translate well. But I also think it's regarding the attitude in which we talk about things and where our conversations are happening and where we are afraid to have you know, clear conversations, and specifically around, and you know, one word that may also not be trapped amongst academia is the word cancel culture, and in terms transformative justice, and these are terms that are becoming more used in terms of in everywhere. And I think that transformative justice is something that's really critical in our communities, especially since, you know, one thing that is really hard is you might have a, you know, a trans woman who is 75 years old and may address herself as a cross-dresser. And there might be a younger trans person or a younger cis person who might go up to that person and be like, actually, you're a transgender. And that's unacceptable. People will identify the ways that they are and who they are, and we should respect those folks' identities. And that time is a huge thing we consistently forget about. Time and history, and specifically how long things have taken, how much time has shifted, and the way in which, you know, folks have been enlightened to even understanding just bare minimums of trans identities. And so it's the way in which we move into spaces. You know, a lot of feminist spaces have started by even just simply stating our pronouns. And, you know, and you might become comfortable with that, but also recognizing that, like, probably only 15% of, you know, the sector uses, you know, I've seen it within, you know, not-for-profits, I've seen it within feminist organizations, and I've seen it in government, you know, using pronouns. But I've been to a lot of, you know, private sector spaces where they're like, what's a pronoun? Why are we providing, you know, and so I think that it's really important for us to try, you know, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to own up to it. Especially if you misgender somebody or something of that sort, you know, you profusely centering yourself and being like, I'm so sorry, I messed up, you know, is not going to help the situation. Apologizing, moving on, and really taking that time that you take, you know, when you're going home, maybe you're drinking some tea, or you're catching up on your news, maybe take that time to do some, you know, self-criticism. And I think we all do this. I do this. I think everyone should. And recognizing, you know, our privilege, our spaces, and our power. Are you ahead of a feminist organization? Are you, you know, are you in power? Is your workplace, you know, especially if you're in a managerial position, is your place trans inclusive rather? You know, do you use pronouns? How are you developing muscle memory to be, you know, trans inclusion all the time? Because it shouldn't be something that you think about. It should be something that's automatic. And so how do you get to that place where it's becoming automatic? It means it takes a lot of practice, it takes a lot of mistakes, and it takes a lot of, you know, self-preservation. And so I think that, like, again, it's great for us to ask, you know, to be able to pressure and get, you know, to be able to get responses from both government organizations to do the work. But you have to start with yourself too, and ensure that you are holding yourself accountable, both when you're making mistakes and also in the positions that you're in. And so I think that, you know, it's both what we do on the outside and the systems that we have control in.
Amazing. I think that's a great way to end it. And I want to thank all of our panelists for your beautiful insight and all the things you shared. I have been taking mental notes on a lot of what you've been saying, and definitely, you know, these are the things that someone like myself, who is coming into the space as a cisgender feminist, and working to build a trans inclusive feminist movement, from our perspective, as being like, the easiest thing you could do is listen. and listen to trans folks. And that's a message that I think is important for all of us to take away from this. And so thank you all for your participation. For those who've been here in the audience, I'm going to throw it to Chloe and the folks of Ottawa Women's March to close us off.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I'll be super quick because I'm pretty like mic drop. I have nothing else to add. Like, what an incredible conversation. And thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us tonight. That was incredible. And yeah, our panelists are also facilitators and school board trustees and other things, so have to run off to other things. You know, I think I always find the academia versus on the ground conversation so interesting. I did my master's degree in gender studies at a very academic institution and like push up against that a lot. And the thing I always come back to is like, if your feminism isn't working, if your feminism isn't working for the people on the ground, it's not working. Like that's it. Like it's just such an important point that I think you can get so caught up in the words and the theories that if it's not working towards the folks who need it the most, then it's not what it's supposed to be. Anyways, I'm going to stop blabbing. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. Please continue to support the work of all of these incredible people. Faye just put in a really important link in the chat, so please go check that out as well, especially if you're involved in any of these feminist types of organizations. Check out our website. We've got a bunch of other cool events going on this week. We've got feminist trivia coming up in an hour, and tomorrow we have a workshop on sex work inclusive feminism with Maggie's Toronto that they're hosting, which is also going to be really exciting, and we're super stoked for it. So thank you so much, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening and rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.